And now, finally, the moment has come. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Ms. Toni Griffin, our 2017 Morton B. Gulak Memorial Lecturer. The title of her lecture, as you can see, is My Just City is Black and White, Seeking Justice Through Planning and Design. Ms. Griffin is the founder of Urban Planning and Design for the American City, based in New York. She's a professor in practice of urban planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Through her New York-based practice, she served as project director for the Long-Range Planning Initiative of the Detroit Work Project. In 2013, she completed and released Detroit Future City, a comprehensive citywide framework plan for urban transformation. But she's actually consulted with many cities on comprehensive planning, among them Memphis, St. Louis, and Milwaukee. She continues to provide insights that are uncommon, all too uncommon in this day and age. We're particularly pleased that she could join us this year, given her expertise in comprehensive planning. As you may know, both the City of Richmond and VCU currently are working on comprehensive plans. We've been pleased to help the city in their efforts, and we're delighted that Ms. Griffin has made herself available to share her insights with our city planners at tomorrow's and VCU planners at tomorrow's breakfast workshop. So please join me now in welcoming Ms. Toni L. Griffin.
No pressure. Thank you, Dean, and members of the Gulak Selection Committee for selecting me, I guess, and inviting me here. It's really quite an honor. Thank you so much, Governor Wilder. What a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for your book. And Mrs. Gulak and the Gulak family, what a lovely gift you've given the school and the students. And to think we're talking about urban designing in a school of government and public policy just warms my heart. So thank you for embracing it. Thank you for recognizing and embracing this work as a part of how cities work and how they come to be the way that they are. So this invitation comes at a time when I was also asked to write an article commissioned by the CERTNA Foundation based in New York. And they said, well, Toni, can you write an article that kind of talks about the most pressing, urban conditions and link that to race? I said, well, okay. I mean, is it kind of related to your program agenda? Do I have any kind of parameters box? No. We just want to hear what you think about urban challenges and race. I was like, where to begin? And also, so I sat on that much longer than I should have based on my deadline. Because I was wanting to think about describing conditions that are already sort of talked about in your textbooks and in your classrooms and talking about urban challenges and conditions, et cetera. And then Charlottesville happened. And that was kind of in the middle of a whole series of things that happen daily when you turn on the news. And I was like, okay. I think I have a direction about how I want to talk. So if you will indulge me, I am talking unscripted tonight and have put together a sort of a series of thoughts and reflections that I hope allow you to join me in my journey of seeking justice through planning and design. Are the lights going to stay full on, or how are we working here? Can everybody see the slides okay? Yeah. I was just going to say if there's any way to dim the lights in the front, that would be good. So let me start with a little bit of background about myself. I am from Chicago. I'm from the south side of Chicago. The map that you're looking at, which many of you may have seen, is a racial dot map. This has been produced for the country, and you can drill down into any city and see the distribution of your city by race. And it's coded by Black population, white population, Asian population, Hispanic population. In this particular map, the blue is African American, the red is white, the orange is Hispanic, and if you can find green, you can find yourself in the Asian population there. So I grew up in a very segregated city. How many in the audience also grew up in segregated cities? Really? I think more of you than you think grew up in a segregated city, and in fact live in a segregated neighborhood, by which I mean you are not living amongst people who are different from you. And we tend to think, and I think normative standards would have you to think that only people like me live in segregated cities, which is not in fact true. We all do. White folks live in segregated cities just as much as black folks. And that's just the kind of condition of our American cities at the time. But this is kind of context and background and helps you to understand why I am framing this talk as my Just City in black and white. It is in fact predicated on how I grew up. The environment I grew up in was a very segregated one. This is my first grade class. Oh, I know. Where am I? Can you find me, Governor? Anyone want to take a stab? Anybody? You don't know me enough, I know. There I am. And I was just having a conversation with Lauren's wife, because she's also tall, and we were talking about how we always used to have to be in the top row of the class picture. This was the one year where they sat us at our desks, and I was in the front. This is like fantastic. But as you can see, most of my classmates look like me. You have to kind of hunt and peck to find people who look like the majority of people in this room, or who look white or different from me. And this is a reflection of that racial dot map, again, right, and who I grew up with. And most of my childhood and most of the things that I could do and spend my average day on did not require me to see anybody who looked different than me. I could go shopping, I could go play, I could go to school. My teachers were white, but the rest of my happy childhood existence I could spend on the south side of Chicago never seeing people very different from me. And as a child, you don't really think anything of that until maybe you're watching television. So I had lunch with the students this afternoon, and one of their questions was, well, what got you interested in architecture? And I gave them a little bit of preview of what I was going to reveal tonight, which is this television show. I was really good at art and drawing. I was doing it all the time, and I watched this show religiously after school. And I loved how Mike Brady could come home with his roll of drawings, go into his office, pull out the paper, and draw. I mean, how cool is that? So I was like, there may be something to this. I also went to a high school where I was able to take drafting, and I had a very encouraging teacher, an encouraging counselor, and it just sort of clicked. My mom always said, do something that you enjoy doing as a career, and it just sort of fell into place. So by the age of 14, I was pretty determined and destined to become an architect, which I did. So here I am, very different picture from the pigtail picture, entering the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture. Probably easier to find me this time. There I am. So here we have a complete shift of my environment and how I'm adjusting and socializing and moving into this new career, which I am super excited about. Now, for whatever reason, my upbringing, my parents, my social network, my teachers, I moved into Notre Dame and this environment, which is very different from what I used to, very seamlessly. I made some of the best friends of my life here. I excelled here at school and graduated. And after 44 hours of licensure, became a licensed architect to find myself practicing in the profession of architecture, where, once again, I stand out. So through my adult career, this has been sort of the new normal for me in the professional space. I am often still, as I was back in school, sometimes the only woman and sometimes the only African American. When I was licensed in Illinois as an architect, I was one of the first 5 black females licensed in Illinois in like 1992. And I was like, really? They're still firsts. And today, out of the 105,000 licensed architects in the US, only 400 are African American women. So this is still a path for which there is not great diversity. Again, I'm telling you this backstory because our backstories do inform and reflect how we view the world. And I believe it's important to kind of understand and own those kind of biases in the way you view the world, so that you can position them in the right way to do the kind of work that I do, which is working in communities that are not always like me. But it's important to have a sense of how I might project things on things, reel that back, and look at the bigger picture. So I'm working through this just city is black and white to perhaps something else, and this is the story I'm going to take you on. So in my career as an architect first, I had the good fortune of working on some pretty extraordinary projects around the world. These are projects that I worked on in London. I also became an associate partner at SOM and led our Detroit work, where we partnered or were hired by General Motors, who was making decisions about whether or not they were going to leave Detroit or not, and decided to stay, purchase the Renaissance Center from the Ford Motor Company, and move their global headquarters here, and we worked on that. I then had the good fortune of doing a Loeb Fellowship at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where I can go and reflect on how I wanted to move and shape my career. Decided to leave private practice of architecture and move into the public sector. My first job was working for Mayor Toni Williams in Washington, D.C. as his deputy planning director. And we really reshaped and rebuilt a new culture of planning in the city that was proactive, based in physical planning, not just regulatory planning. So over the 6 years that I had the good fortune of working for the mayor, we developed over 50 plans for the city, a number of which have actually been executed. This is Washington, D.C., and this was an important diagram for us because we were at a moment in the early 2000s where there was a reinstated confidence in city government. We had just come out of receivership. Clinton was in office. New relationships were being forged between the federal government and the city, and the economy was growing. Businesses and companies were moving back into the city, as were people. And so it was a moment where we needed to stop and think about what was the public good that we needed to protect and enhance and get a front of market forces that were going to shape the city. Now, in hindsight, we can argue whether we were successful or not. That's a whole nother lecture. But it was important that we do that. A number of our projects were projects where we, again, tried to look for ways to magnify the public good. Some of the ways we did that were in creating new public open space where there was not open space. Some of the ways we did that was, some would argue, is in bringing baseball back to the nation's capital and designing the ballpark in a very urbanistic way along the river. I left working for Mayor Toni Williams and was tapped by Cory Booker once he was elected office in his first term to also help him reinstate a professional planning office. So I spent 2 years working with him. The recession hit, so this wasn't as robust a time of development that I had in Washington, D.C., but it was a time to think very creatively about underlying regulatory reform and positioning the city to be able to facilitate and embrace smarter development. So this is a project we did looking at infill housing, for example. Now, you might kind of track through that very quick story that with each city I go to, there's an increasingly larger amount of challenges that they each kind of face. So there's Chicago, and then I come to actually New York, and then DC, and then Newark, and then Detroit, and then Memphis, and then St. Louis, and then Milwaukee. So yeah, I am really kind of interested in crisis and challenge. But in reflecting upon that, as I started teaching, I was really very aware of the fact that with each of those cities I went to work in or for, I was confronting very similar urban challenges. I was always confronting a population or a part of the city that had been long disinvested. I was always confronting a sense that people were living in segregated geographies, and there were very few spaces in the city where you could go and actually see people of different backgrounds and races and professions, mingling and actually engaging with one another. I was confronting issues of very weak sort of civil society or civic infrastructure where folks weren't used to being asked to come to a planning meeting where their opinion mattered. They were used to people doing things to their community instead of with their community. And so I wanted to, while I was in the space of the academy, examine this a little bit more and ask myself this question of whether or not design could really address some of these underlying issues and challenges that I was being asked to confront as a designer. Whether design either could be implicated in those conditions, or whether design could actually be a tool to use to overcome some of those conditions. And so this is the cities that I've been working in. I've not had a lot of good fortune to work west of the Mississippi, but you can see here again that I'm in these cities that are either Rust Belt cities or legacy cities or contested cities. So let's come back to the summer. Let's go back to November of 2016. Let's go back to next week. We had a conference at Harvard last week called Black in Design, which was meant to showcase the ways in which people of color are contributing to the space of design. And it was a really interesting audience of folks that was actually very diverse. And as I was listening to speakers, and we were talking about the kind of agency and activism and advocacy that we needed to embed in our art and in our design and in our planning, it struck me that part of that, and I feel this too, is this reaction to assaults that at least I feel constantly, and I feel constantly that my students are feeling and that they talk to me about. These assaults on the body and the way in which we're talking about and needing to take to public space to talk about the protection of women, the protection of the Black body, and we're taking to public spaces and advocating for the way in which our lives matter. The brown body, the way in which we're talking about immigration policy, and the way in which we're continuing to marginalize certain populations based on a certain status of citizenry. The white body feels harmed and assaulted and is retaken to public space to express their anger and fears and concerns. LGBTQ community continues to be fearful and feel assaulted. And I put these assaults up because they're coming at us through conversations about policy, regulation, reform, and everyday life. These things that really do have an urgency and are being discussed in the public realm, in the spaces that we create. Healthcare. When we go to the space of the urban and the way in which we talk about who belongs in your neighborhood, who belongs in your city, the assaults continue. The assault on the planet, the repeal of reforms that are helping to protect our climate and our ecosystems. Urban violence continues to plague and makes us fearful in the spaces we should feel the most safe. The need to feel a sense of protection different from a sense of surveillance, and the thin line of which who feels what depending on what space they're in. The voice of identity. Whose identity deserves to inhabit the public realm? Who gets to decide that? Why is it either or? There is pain and hurt and vulnerability on all sides. How is the narrative of this country to be told? How we inhabit space to protect our justice, to express our justice, confront our justice, and the voice of our rights. And when do we get to exercise them? Who tells us how to exercise them and well? I wanted to bring these assaults up because they're very much kind of in my consciousness, and I'm really grappling with the role that I play as a planner and designer in confronting those, because they inevitably come up when I'm talking about issues, whether it's an affordable housing issue, whether it's an issue about transportation and transportation systems, whether it's a conversation about the utilization of capital spending in a city, whether it's about neighborhood development. At some point, some of these issues just kind of come to the forefront. And so as a planner, and always an evolving planner, I've sort of gone from being a person who sort of designs these buildings and spaces to really thinking about the agency that those spaces have and for who and how can they be used in support of the conversation and the work we have to do as a nation. So one of my big lessons, particularly for the planning students, is this intersectionality of the spatial and the social, and how we work our agency to connect those things and better both of those things. So this idea of the Just City came to me in 2011 when I was asked to lead the start of the J. Max Bond Center at the City College of New York, named after a very famed African-American architect, J. Max Bond, cousin of Julian Bond, and also one of the designers of the National Museum of African-American History and Culture on the Mall with David Ajay and Phil Freelon. That was my opportunity to, outside of practice and outside of the classroom, really develop a research agenda to test this idea. Can design have an impact on social justice? And I was really very intrigued by the notion of the Just City. I just come from a conference that the Ford Foundation held, and they used this term. A colleague of mine, Susan Feinstein, who's an urban planning professor, had just written a book called The Just City. And I liked it different from using equity or sustainability or resiliency because it placed on it an urgency around this notion of being restorative. And recognizing that, in fact, there are these sort of aspects of fairness and justice by which we find ourselves living in certain conditions and by which we have to confront if we are actually going to make greater gains in evolving and revitalizing and changing those conditions. So I use the term to intentionally be confrontational, to intentionally put a little unease. And it's interesting, we did this sort of crowdsource exercise and asked people what they meant by justice. And a lot of folks really kind of went straight to procedural justice, like the court system. If you ask the average person on the street, and younger people in particular, which is really interesting, they kind of went to that form of justice. But there is restorative justice. There's interpersonal justice. There are all these forms that justice creates. And so I'm very intrigued by this idea. And started in 2011 without any sort of notion of where it would lead me. Started going into lectures and sort of talking about the unfinished city, the fact that we confront all of these underlying sort of conditions in urban city after urban city, and they have these legacy of policies and frameworks that contributed to some of the conditions that we're still grappling with today. And what is my role as a planner and designer in changing this, really meaningfully changing it in a sustainable way, not just sort of redeveloping it for the moment, only to find in 20 years later the underlying conditions still remain. So I started sort of crafting my definition of this, and this kind of evolved over the last several years. A just city is where all people and communities, but especially the least not included, have equitable and inclusive access to environments that offer opportunities and resources to be productive and prosperous, advancing social and economic mobility and agency of both people and place. It's my attempt to stress again the importance of our work as planners and designers to think about the intersections of people and place through our work, even if our intervention in the end is something spatial, right? To keep those two things very connected. I also here, you might notice, take a pretty specific stand on who I am prioritizing I want to work on the Just City for, and it is the least not included. It's not to say that I don't think the Just City is for everyone. I think it is, and everyone has to be involved in creating it. But I do feel there is a restorative aspect to the way I'm starting to frame the Just City, and we can debate and discuss that if you like. So while I was at the Bond Center, I created a body of projects that helped to advance the thinking on this. I created a course called Design for the Just City. I commissioned a series of essays, and this is a free downloadable ebook called The Just City Essays. If you go to designforthejustcity.org, you can obtain a copy of this and read it. And I wanted to just sort of put out into the world to other people. How do other people think about this? How do other people in other countries think about this? So I have 26 authors representing 5 countries in 22 different cities talking about the different ways with which justice plays out, from Paris to South Africa to Minneapolis to Gary. So now I want to come back to the request that Sertna made of me, which was to kind of connect these things to race. And again, sort of coming out of the summer and thinking about it, I started thinking about divides and the ways in which race divides. And here we have to go back a little bit, because I think it is important for us to be very clear that there were a set of systems and structures designed to divide by race. So I want you to take a minute and read this slide very carefully, because this is part of a legal land deed covenant that is restricting a certain group of people from access to property. There were federal laws that supported housing finance institutions that redlined certain parts of the city and restricted federal home loans to certain communities of certain colors. There were real estate practices known as block busting, which would intentionally go into a white neighborhood, buy their property, move a black family in at a much higher cost. And this was during the era of what you might have known as white flight. So there are these, when people talk about institutional racism, this is what they mean. And some even argue that the practice of predatory lending from 10 years plus ago was another tool or tactic that was designed to take advantage of vulnerable populations, poor and people of color, and do a similar type of redlining within certain communities. So it's important to understand that context and to remember that these are systems and policies that have their histories dating back 70 plus years, and how we are still trying to unravel ourselves from some of those conditions. But the reason you see the racial dot maps the way you do is in some cities predicated on these conditions. So we have a lot of work to do. This is your city, Richmond. And I'm sorry it's a little faint. And here the colors are different. The greenish yellow color is African American population, and the blue is white populations. So if you didn't think you lived in a segregated city and you're from here, there's a little bit of evidence to show that you might be living more separate from people than you think. No judgment, that's just how it is. So these race divides kind of fell into 3 categories for me: social, power, and economic. So the social divides. So just some insights that I wanted to share. So as a part of kind of doing the research and writing my article, I found some really interesting sort of facts. So this fact comes from a study, and I'm sorry, I don't have my information on my screen here, but it's a Public Regional Research Institute, and they did some research on our networks, right, to examine how many of us have networks and friends that are different from ourselves, and very few of us do, according to this survey. And because we don't have each other in our networks, we tend to rely a lot on popular culture and media and movies and film and music, and sometimes we build certain stereotypes about the other that may not be true. We might not all do this, we might not all do any of these, but we, us living in urban environments, are not necessarily like other people in the country. So we do have to admit that there are folks who form their decisions based on very limited actual access and information. There's also an interesting study that then spatialized that for us. So not only do we not network across different ethnicities, we don't live next to one another in the same communities. And so over the past 30 years, the presence of African Americans in a typical white person's neighborhood has really changed very little. So we're still not kind of cross-pollinating in terms of where we spend the majority of our time in our neighborhoods and in our homes. And this sort of plays out when we start talking about gentrification and this notion that certain indigenous community members have when their neighborhood starts to change, that gentrification is this sort of intentional racist act, right? Which I don't think it is. I teach a whole class on this semester. But part of that sort of socialization can very easily lead folks to believe that. And I mean that by black folks not having a lot of exposure to white folks, just as it happens the other way around. Those bifurcations set up conditions and arguments like this that can be sometimes false. So how do we begin to heal notions of social divide that are race-based? I think the values, and the Dean spoke about this, that values should help shape our built environment. The values of inclusion, belonging, and respect, I think, are some of the essential values needed to help heal social divides. And one example I might offer up in the realm of design is one of my favorite public spaces. It happens to be in my hometown, but I'm really not biased. I really think this space is extraordinary, and it's the Crown Fountain and the Bean in Millennial Park. And here's why. So remember I showed you that Chicago is a very divided city by race. There are very few neighborhoods and therefore public spaces where you can actually go and be with people who are different than you, and not just be with them by standing next to them, but there's an engagement that happens. At the fountain, little kids run through the water, and you're standing next to people who you would not stand next to talking because your kids are playing. When you go to the Bean, you're standing there and you're looking at the reflection of yourself and everyone who's around you. And it's fun and engaging, and you can't help but engage the person next to you. I think there's such a brilliance in the design of these spaces, which I don't know if the artist intended. But for a city like this to have these mechanisms that bring people together, I just think is incredibly brilliant. Power divides. So you're probably taught the same thing I was taught when I was in school, where you're looking at urban design and some of the most extraordinary urban plans of our country, and you're learning about who designed them. When I was in school, I don't remember hearing about a single architect of color, and I certainly didn't have any instructors that were of color. And I was taught to admire and understand these great cities built by these great men. So not only are they men, and I'm sorry, they are white, but it's a very top-down sort of structure. So we're also not sort of looking at city building through the eyes of the populace and the citizenry. And they're extraordinary plans and have created amazing urban forms for us to continue to build upon. But I think these power structures and the notion of who gets to set the table, who decides how the table is set, in addition to who's at the table, helps to perpetuate, continued racial divides. So part of how we have to heal that, repair that, reverse that, is through valuing representation, participation, and various forms of merit. Who gets to decide what is good, what is acceptable, what we should value as opinion? I had the opportunity to work for 3 very extraordinary African-American mayors, and I have such admiration for anyone who decides to become an elected official. Thank you again, Governor Wilder, for that. Yeah, you're a little insane, and your families have to be too. But the leadership, what I've learned by working from these mayors is the culture of a city, the progress of a city, and you know this because you've been a mayor also, really comes from the top. And it's really extraordinary to sort of watch how that culture of that person and that identity sort of migrates through the way things do and don't happen. But by having and encouraging people of color and women, and any of those groups that I showed you before, to become active participants in the public realm and in government and in public service, I think is really essential and must be expanded upon. So even if you're studying design, as I did, spending time in the public sector, which is why I went to School of Public Affairs and Government, is such a valuable and needed, because your voice has agency, and we need that agency to help set the tables, so that the tables become more like this, and the practice of city building and community building can be more representative, that we can value not just our technical expertise that we've been trained to value, but also a level of community expertise, the lived experience of someone in a community, and the knowledge that they'll bring to the table will only enhance and supplement that which you are technically trained to bring forward. And the third divide is the economic divide. So here, a few more facts. So this is a study done in Minneapolis about 2011, and they have a very progressive mayor, Betsy Rogers, who's very much embraced this sort of notion of equity in the city. Really wanted to put pen to paper to illuminate the ways in which disparities were happening within her city and in the region. And this is a map that's showing what we think we all know, but really putting metrics to it by helping us to understand that by employment, hourly wages, and ownership, people of color fare far worse than Caucasians. Even when you normalize that for certain factors of educational, household composition, et cetera, there's still great disparities. Why is that? If we take all these other issues off the table, you're the same in terms of education, you're the same in terms of neighborhood condition, you're the same in terms of household type. There's still this disparity. Why is that so? Another study done by Joe Courtwright that was looking at this hype on gentrification, in fact shows us that there are more poor neighborhoods that are still poor between 1970 and 2010 than have gentrified. So if you read the paper and watch the news, gentrification is running rampant. Poor neighborhoods, beware, you're being taken over, right? When in fact, the majority of neighborhoods that were poor 40 years ago still are. And this is particularly looking at urban areas, and one thing we do know as well, that people of color are the predominant poor population in urban areas. So we can easily translate this to race again. Going back to our racial dot map, anyone know what the city is? Nope. Detroit. And that very sharp horizontal line that's separating black and white is Eminem's 8 Mile. So it is a street that divides race in the majority of the city. And this is a city that's 82% African American population. Yet when we start to look at some of the economic data around that population, we find that it's the majority of the workforce, but it's only 15% of the firms that are owned by African American, of all firms, right? And you can translate that to the number of revenues that they're generating. So for a city that is majority black, we are not controlling business interests, business revenues. Why is that? you might ask. So how do we start to recover, reverse this sense of economic inclusivity? Access, ownership, and what I call creative innovation are three values I'd like to offer up. And in Detroit, they're starting to do that. So coming out of the work we did in Detroit Future City, there are a whole series of actions that we proposed. And one that was directly tied to beginning to reverse the disparities around economic ownership is a program called Motor City Match. It is specifically designed, because Detroit is also a city where there's a great entrepreneurial spirit and people are starting to migrate into the city. It's still affordable, it's still relatively easy to do a startup. Land is cheap. You can come and be very entrepreneurial and creative there. But what about the folks who live there and are trying to participate in that renaissance? So this is a program that is specifically designed for resident-owned businesses and entrepreneurs that have a business, want to start a business. And it walks them through a program of planning, identifying space, designing that space, designing your business plan, and access to capital. And so this is a form of providing access and prosperity to a group of residents who otherwise wouldn't have it, because there's an intentionality to target them to participate in the local economy. And here's just an example of some of the local business owners that are participating in that program. So let's take this back to design. So as I'm wrestling with these race divides and going back to my central question about design, I started thinking about design movements and what they suggest they offer in terms of revitalization of cities and communities. And I remained a bit skeptical and perhaps maybe critical of the way in which our current and previous movements are addressing these social and spatial justice issues that I've come to care about. So I know this city is very fond of new urbanism, so I won't speak ill of it. It is an urbanism that is designed to correct sort of our patterns of sprawl, to value density and urban form and contextualism. And I think for a community like Richmond, it has been extraordinarily valuable in helping you preserve the character and integrity that makes Richmond the city that it is. I don't know how much it ascribed to addressing issues of social justice. Everyday urbanism is a form of urbanism which kind of came a bit as a critique and counter to new urbanism, which says, look, cities via Jane Jacobs already have an organic urbanism. It's the people and how we inhabit and appropriate those spaces that create a form of urbanism and aesthetic that really becomes more valuable to the identity of place. So it's we in this room who appropriate space and make of it something that becomes an identity and something special and authentic about your city. Sustainable urbanism is where we're now really kind of thinking about how we're designing everything from buildings to infrastructure to open space with a true intentionality around addressing issues of climate change and resiliency. Landscape urbanism says, you know what, it's really the ecological systems that structure and form the city. And then there's back to the small scale of tactical urbanism, which suggests that, you know, our larger systems are broken. Government can no longer afford to create the kind of city environments that we want. We're going to DIY it ourselves. So designers kind of took the reins, saw problems in urban areas, and sought design solutions to address or bring attention to those issues. I want to talk about a just urbanism. I'm starting this little framework of evaluating the different urbanisms and the ways in which they address different scales, different disciplines of design, different systems, including economic and civic systems, social justice issues, and the way in which different actors, either the grass tops or the grassroots, and I call professionals kind of in a separate band, interact in each of these spaces and how much overlap there is. My aspiration with a just urbanism is that we're slicing across many more of these areas than I believe some of the current forms of urbanism are doing. So here's my first attempt, previewed here, on what I think a just urbanism might include. I view it as a disruptive framework of policies and practices that produce outcomes designed to break down historic spatial and social structures and systems of oppression, inequality, and access. And I'm beginning to think about these principles that I think we might have to consider. First, I think urbanism, and by urbanism I mean sort of the practice of planning and design and creating urban civic city environments of any scale, has to embrace the fact that design is political. I think it has to embrace accountability, the role in which we play as collaborators in shaping our space. I do think we have to embrace the aspect of being restorative, of correcting some of the underlying harmful things that were put in place to separate us. We need to correct those. We need to own that they did, and then we need to correct them. And I think in order to do that, we have to be disruptive. We have to kind of move into some uncomfortable conversations. We have to disrupt maybe some traditional practices in order to really crack open new solutions for more longer-term sustainable correction. I believe that just urbanism has to be value-based, and I believe that there has to be a level of cultural competency, that we've got to learn and correct the fact that we don't socialize across spaces of difference. And that if we want to do this work, and I'm maybe now specifically talking to the students, if you want to go out in the world and do this work, you are likely going to be doing this work in communities that don't look like you or reflect where you're from. We have to develop a cultural competency that allows us to be effective in delivering the expertise we have to the communities who deserve it. I believe we absolutely have to be cross-disciplinary. I can no longer do urban design and planning work if I don't have an economist with me, if I don't have a historian with me, if I don't have sometimes a geographer with me, if I don't have an artist with me, if I don't have a city agency person with me, if I don't have a community person with me. All of these expertise are essential to solving any of these tracks of planning. And I have to value communities' expertise just as much as I value technical expertise. And then lastly, it's got to set tables that include both the grass tops and the grassroots. When we started Detroit, it was so interesting that folks wanted to, they were fearful that this would be a plan that would be done behind a closed door by the mayor, and I totally get that because there have been plans done behind closed doors in many of our cities, and people bore the brunt of that. So that is a legitimate fear. But their counter to that was, well, we just want a community-based plan. Let us do our plan, and then we'll take it to the grass tops. Well, to me, none of those scenarios worked because it was always one side planning in isolation and then asking you to, or demanding in some cases, for you to deliver that. Why not start from the same table to begin with and hash all this out as a part of the plan, right? So it's got to be cross-sectoral to work. So these are some of the conditions or principles that I'm suggesting if we want to talk about social and spatial justice and our efficacy in that as planners and designers, that a just urbanism might be something we need to consider. So how will we know it when we see it? I'm almost done. So I have 3 examples to share with you on how we might begin to know we're achieving the just city when we see it. So the first one is really getting back to values. So I've spent a lot of time, in some ways a little bit obsessed about values that I think, and if any of you happen to have read my essay in the Just City essays called My Just City is Black and White, I, at that time, which is now 2 years ago, sort of put out 10 values that I thought were essential to the just city. As I've continued to do this work, I now believe there are 50. And in fact, I've come to 50, or our lab has come to 50, because we actually have crowdsourced this quite a bit. We've had opportunities to go into forums like this where I pass out a card and you tell me what the Just City is. I've had opportunities, for example, to work with Heinz Endowment in Pittsburgh as they were restructuring their program areas within the foundation and wanted to adopt the Just City platform, and we went through this exercise. So what I found is our instinct might be, let's just have a few, because like having so many, I get overwhelmed by choice. But what I found, to use an example from welfare again, that one person's protection was another person's surveillance, right? That there were these real nuances and distinctions between equality and equity. And sometimes when we go to the one term or the one value or the 5 values, you tend to lump a bunch of stuff under that. And you miss some of the nuance that particular communities really might need to focus on, like tolerance or respect, right? So we set out to develop a vocabulary for communities and cities to use, and instead of things like resiliency and sustainability that have a kind of prescripted set of values that if you're not these, you're not that every community, from a Houston to a Richmond to a New York to a Sao Paulo to a Medellin, has a different definition of a just city because of the inherent conditions of that context. So every city should be able to create their own just city value proposition or manifesto. So we want to create a tool that allows communities to do that. So hence we introduced our index of 50 values. A few weeks ago, we had an opportunity to workshop that with 16 projects from around the country. We asked them to think about and describe the ways with which those design interventions were achieving certain values. And then within table workshops, participants got to critique and help assess the project and its effectiveness towards addressing certain values. We workshopped a project, for example, called the Creative Reaction Lab out of St. Louis, which is designed to build a civic capacity of leaders to engage. So it kind of goes back to that power divide. And they workshop a set of indicators and values they believe that organization and their programs have the potential to really advance in St. Louis. We're ultimately hoping to create a body of case studies around several projects as examples of how different values actually operate in the built environment. A practice example would be my work in Detroit and the release of Detroit Future City. Here, a couple of things are important to note. One is that notion that it needed to be really cross-sectoral. So we set up a project infrastructure that was not just the city, not just community, not just business sector, not just philanthropy, but all of those sectors sitting at the table. It was not just a team of consultants that came in and did the work. We had a very robust set of community activists and process leaders that lent very particular expertise and did work which they were paid for to help facilitate not only the technical work, but the civic engagement work. And the foundation of all of that was the community. And in this case, we define community not as you might typically think as going out and talking to residents, which when I use the term community, that's what most people think, going out and talking to Mrs. Jones and her neighbors. Community was much more diverse to that, and it was all those sectors that I've been talking about. And what we realized in doing the kind of robust engagement that we did, that we were not only sort of trying to build a just city, we were also trying to build a just citizenry. We were trying to build the capacity of folks within the community, the broad sectors of the community, to learn how to be in the same room, debate and talk with one another, but ultimately be able to make decisions and activate and collectively work together. And that was not something that was necessarily embedded in the culture of Detroit. And through working the year and a half that we did, really built some new collaborations, some new partnerships, and some new institutions that are carrying out the work. We had intentionality about describing specific, what we called imperatives, the things we must do. And there's several of them here that I'm just pointing out and I won't really read. But in the language, what we were trying to do was really create a specific attention to focusing on how the actions that we created were going to benefit residents who were there, as well as new residents and new businesses. It was important to actually say that. Because sometimes when you don't say it, you don't develop programs like Motor City Match that are intended to address that population. So the specificity of language when you're writing plans is so important. Otherwise, it's a plan that I don't know where it's from. It's got to be contextualized and understood relative to how it responds to the local conditions, the local beneficiaries that you imagine take advantage of your actions. It was cross-disciplinary in that it was not just a land use plan. This was something we were talking about earlier today in the context of comprehensive plans, which, as they're regulated by your municipality, tend to be very land use driven. Detroit's conditions were not created because of the land. There were conditions that contributed to the fact that there are 100,000 vacant parcels in Detroit, right? So those are the things that needed to be solved for as well. So we had to look at not only the land use plan, we had to look at how the city was using resources, and at this point limited resources because it lost 60% of its population, to deliver water and electricity and trash delivery and all of those things to a city that is 139 square miles, size for a population of 1.8 million people, but now is under 7. Great inefficiencies in that. So if I just change the land use plan and don't change how the city operates its services, I've really missed something in terms of how I, as a resident, understand the city. I don't really care about a land use plan. It does nothing for me, right? So I had to look at that. We had to look at transportation. We had to look at where jobs were and where we could build more jobs. And we took approaches in terms of creating typologies of neighborhoods that really began to embed some of these values. So this is a little cartoon vignette that says, let's think about how we can appropriate some of the industrial space that is no longer in a 20th century form of production and change that into something that's entrepreneurial for use. So what if we convert that to a space that teaches young people how to repair bikes or cars or something? And while we're doing that and helping them build that technical skill, let's also teach them about entrepreneurship. And then let's help them grow a business. And let's support that business through Motor City Match. And then let's try to figure out how they can buy the building and that their business now owns the property in which they're doing business in. So that whole sort of cycle of ownership that sort of starts with the idea of how we're designing space kind of goes through all the loops of economic divides, power divides, and social divides. We also thought very critically about ensuring that this didn't become, and I think this is still the biggest challenge, of how the work and where investment goes doesn't just happen in one part of the city, like the downtown or the midtown corridor, but how we really think very distributively about how resources are deployed in every corner of the city. And this is something that Kresge thought very carefully about with other funders, in addition to the new mayor, Mayor Duggan, who has a very robust neighborhood campaign to help implement. The last example I will leave you with in terms of what does such a city look like might be found through measurement. So one of the last projects we did at the Bond Center was a collaboration with Gale Architects out of Copenhagen, who was very interested in exploring the ways in which their strategies for Mayor Bloomberg to create public plazas out of reclaimed streets and devote those back to pedestrians. What kind of impact were they making other than just your typical economic impact analysis? Were they really helping to create better public life? And they learned of the work we were doing around social justice and wanted to also consider whether it was making a social justice impact. So we collaborated for a year, combined our different methodologies to evaluate both public life and urban justice. And you can see here, these were the 10 values that we used. We used several forms of data collection, sort of desktop research, secondary research. Here, it was important, and I think this is really something that's very distinct around the model that we're building, is that, and really to understand the way in which justice might be working in public space or in our cities is not just by the information we can collect through sitting at our computer, but it actually has to be understood by how people use it. And when you combine those two things together, I think you get a more accurate picture of the effectiveness of our design intentions. So we use observational surveys, intercept surveys, and interviews on top of the secondary research to help support our findings. There are actually 50 of these plazas all throughout New York and all 5 boroughs. We focused on 7 that were in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. This is the most popular one that you see in Times Square, in the conversion of taking the streets. And this was such a groundbreaking piece of work because, and it was so logical, right? So most of the right-of-way you give to cars, even though there are more people in the space than cars. And just that counterintuitive reversal of that just created quite an ingenious, I think, urban design strategy. And so here's just some of the quick findings I'll leave you with. So one of the things that we were interested in is how they were used across the different plazas. And we found that the caretakers of the space, and in order to get one of these plazas in New York, it has to be a community-based organization that agrees to be the steward of it, fundraise for it, maintain it, et cetera. And so we found that across the board, whether it was a Manhattan plaza that's in the meatpacking district or in front of Macy's, or whether it was in a real kind of neighborhood out in the outer boroughs, they were all sort of activated by programming that people use on a regular basis, so we're excited to see that. We found that they're using the plazas to meet one another, which is something Gail aspired to, is it creating more public life and socialization. And so we found that it did. We also found, and I'm sorry, it's on the screen, I can't read what it says. We found that 53% of people did something. I can't read it, but you can. We were very curious about, oh, here it is, I can read it here. Across all plazas, we had a survey question that said, since the plaza's been open, do you, have you met people that you had not met before? And an overwhelming people say, yeah, like there are people I didn't know. Then we ask a follow-up question is, have you built a relationship with new people since that? And that, the number went down a little bit. But we're on to a start of something. Like we just didn't want to say, plazas create good social capital. Okay, well tell me how, right? So we're really wanting to kind of go beyond the rhetoric of you doing it and really kind of create some evidence, which is not something we really do in the design discipline. And so we were really excited to find some of these numbers. So here's that question. Do you recognize or know more people? And we got really good responses. You will notice if you know New York, and my friend that I just met, Suzanne, that the Flatiron District and the Meatpacking District were 2 places in Manhattan where people don't socialize that much than they did in the neighborhoods. And there's all sorts of, I think, contextual reasons why that is. So I don't want to blast the Manhattan plazas. But it was really interesting when we started to look at it relative to the context in which the plazas were in. And then we were able to create segmentations of that by race, by gender, by income, and et cetera. And we found it really interesting that lower income populations of people did the more socializing than more affluent people. And we deduced that that could be because it was younger people that would fall in that income bracket. It could also be seniors or older people who spend more time in the public space. So there's lots of backstory to these, but again, I found the data was beginning to tell us really interesting things. We found that people reported an increased perception of safety. 66% of all plaza folks felt that their safety increased a lot, and so that was really good, and one of the intentions of the plaza to create more safe spaces. And then we were really curious about ownership, like to the extent that you feel like this public space belongs to you, that it's part of your public realm of your neighborhood, and you should feel free and a sense of belonging when you go. And we found that most people really did feel like the plaza was theirs. It was interesting when we asked that question in Manhattan plazas, again, the numbers went really down. And when we probed about that, we found that in the Manhattan plazas where a lot of people who moved to that space were visitors from another city or another neighborhood, they were like, they didn't. But then again, it's public, right? So how much should we all feel a sense of belonging and welcome in the public realm, even though it's not the public realm of your neighborhood? So that raised another really interesting question for us, and you can see the results there. So I am hopeful that my Just City that has been black and white will become more colorful, in part through the interactions I have with students, in part through the way in which I continue to unpack and explore and I check myself around the ways in which I have viewed the world and from where I come from, but recognizing that my aspiration for it is it to move beyond just being black and white. So thank you.
Toni, thank you.
Was that too long?
No.
Okay.
You could have gone on for another 30 minutes.
No.
That's wonderful. Wonderful information. A lot to think about. A lot of great examples for us to use in Richmond. We appreciate you sharing.
Thank you.
Ms. Griffin has graciously agreed to take on a few more questions in the next 10 or 12 minutes we have before we wrap up. We've got 2 microphones on either side. If you have burning questions, please step up, state your name, and then state the question.
And let me just say again, so the website designforthejustcity.org has both the Just City essays and also has the full report of the public life and urban justice study. So if you want to see the full set of metrics and findings, you can download that there. Oh, and the Just City Index. You can also download that too. Okay, well, good night.
Not that quick. Not that quick. I'm going to ask one question. Well, no, AJ's at the mic. Go ahead, AJ.
I've only been to Detroit once. When I lived in Toronto, I drove down there with a friend. I was just wondering, I don't know much about the situation there and the planning there, but to what extent is there an overlap between Toronto and Windsor, Ontario, across the border? Is there
Not that much.
coordination or nothing at all?
Not that much. At least from my perspective where we're doing the planning work, not that much, to be honest. I'm trying to think of something to say that might give you a bit more.
For the Amazon, to bid for Amazon.
I heard that. Okay.
We're Detroiters.
Oh, okay, great.
Joined to bid for Amazon.
Yeah, I heard that
Yeah.
Detroit was saying that if Amazon locates there, they would be able to benefit from taking the market.
Windsor was part of the proposal. It was
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a loss of sort of labor force commuting back and forth, so that would make sense that would happen. But from the perspective of our planning framework, because Detroit had been so overlooked and discounted regionally, both in terms of confidence in its government. I'm looking at the young lady in the back and she's shaking her head. Sort of lack of confidence in government, lack of resources, just, bad MO all around. We were really intentional about reminding the region and the country of the importance and the values and the assets that Detroit still had, and that it could not be discounted as an important central factor in the region. So we were very internal focused at the time that we did the plan.
Swing back over here.
Hi, I'm a student in the Urban Studies program.
Hi.
And I'm just curious, like for most of our students, what the best resources would be to learn more about these issues outside of the classroom. Like you had lots of charts and graphics up there, and where do you sort of get this information and access it as well?
Yeah, one book I would encourage you to get right away is called The Color of Law by Robert Rothschild, and it's just released this year, and it is a really nice inventory of some of the legacy policies that I talked about that have created some of our conditions of segregation. So that would be one book I would put on my list, but you've just given me a great idea to put like a reading list on our website of things that students like you could explore to unpack this issue a little bit more. But that's one book that I would suggest that you pick up up and start to read through.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for facilitating this presentation.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you about wealth and wealth distribution.
Okay.
To start off by, I'm also from Chicago.
You're from Chicago?
Yeah,
Okay.
very segregated section of that little map there. But one thing that really shocked me as I grew was that some people that I met over time they had a very large safety net and a very large pool of wealth to pick from once they became adults, and they could really turn into something. So in your research and you're kind of expanding knowledge of different cities and entrepreneurs and trying to bring that to minority groups and to people of lower incomes, could you maybe expand on how people kind of overcome that, I would call it like a sense of dread and inaccessibility to economic wealth, and how that relates?
I'll try from my humble position as a planner and designer to give some insights. I've just been becoming really, really interested in understanding more about kind of wealth distribution and wealth access because, again, a lot of the neighborhoods or cities that I'm working in, I have a neighborhood where those are the conditions, right? Where the resident population there does not or has not had a certain access to me, simply throwing money on improving the physical condition isn't going to be enough. Somehow household wealth and the sort of movement of those households through various sort of income classes is what's going to be more important so that their ability to make choices is there, right? I think that's become a really essential value for me. I think a little bit it gets back to the circles we find ourselves in. There's a professor, Nancy DiTomasi out of Rutgers, who writes about the fact that because of those bifurcated social circles, when you think about those of us who are in a position to make recommendations and refer people and hire people, you're going to do that from your network. And if your network isn't diverse, guess what? Right? And if you're not in a network that can get you that access. So there is something about this kind of social divide piece that I'm beginning to write about, which again is exacerbated because we're segregated by space, that doesn't sometimes put us in the circles of networks because a lot of us, have become more advantaged by our networks. Yeah, we're all smart people, but that plus your networks, really contributes. So somehow we've got to find ways to create more spaces and more opportunities where you are commingling different people, right? So that we can be elevated and moving each other through these different circles. So the work that we were doing in Milwaukee, which again set this very cross-sectoral set of people, which I was really kind of insistent that we do, and it was very easy for them to do it because they have a very collaborative civic culture, was to ensure that folks that were working on the ground with not a lot of resource were at the same decision-making table as those with the actual resource, right? So I think that's got to be a start of it. And then there are all sorts of other kind of conversations around entrepreneurial literacy and financial literacy, and so how our communities become more confident and comfortable in moving into those spaces, I think is really important. You're welcome.
Young lady.
Hello, my name is Alejandra Quiñones. Thank you so much for being here tonight and speaking with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I work for a nonprofit called Renew Richmond, which focuses on food scarcity and bringing access to food equity to people who are underserved. And I think you might have already answered a bit of my question, but I'll take it from this aspect and see if you can expand upon it a little bit more. So I am having a little bit of I don't know if I'm able to really. We've been having problems with engagement from the community, and I think it might be a lack of trust from people who don't look like me. And so I was wondering if you could expand upon and give advice to me on how out to you?
Yeah. I think sometimes it probably is a lack of trust. Your instinct on that is probably right. And I think when that's the case, you can't start the relationship by asking people to engage where you want them to, right? Which is, okay, we want to do a plan. You got to kind of talk to me to do the plan. But I don't really trust you. I don't know you. So you have to think about it in the way in which you build any relationship, right? Which is to build a relationship, maybe separate from your long-term goal of building this plan and talking about this particular issue and getting them to participate in that. Maybe you have to set tables that are much more neutral, which is just a get to know each other, right? Have them get to know you, get to know your work, get to know the work of the agency. So it's like an awareness, education, relationship building phase that maybe you have to start with that establishes a relationship that then allows them to build more trust, that when you invite them to the table around some specific content that you want to move forward and get their input in, maybe co-creating with you, you'll all be kind of better at ease to do the more meaningful work. So you may have to step back from what you think you need to do and do something that's very baseline in terms of building relationships. You're welcome.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Jonathan. So you spoke a lot about deconcentrating poverty for the purpose of getting people to occupy the same spaces, therefore they'll, among other reasons, but they'll interact more. But in cases like the meatpacking industry where, on one side of the street you'll have housing projects and on the other side you'll have extremely wealthy high-rise apartments, how, and based on the data that you showed as well as, just seen on the streets, how do you get those two groups to be less segregated on racial and economic lines and interacting with each other to get closer to the just city when there's still, or when space is not the issue separately?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the deconcentration of poverty and spaces where people of different can engage don't have to be the same sort of battle or thing to do, right? I think you can fight them separately and together. So just to make that clear. I think, when you were asking your question, I began to think about the High Line in particular in New York, right? Which is, while lovely and wonderful and enjoyable, gets critiqued because it has fueled a level of growth and value for lands around that I can't afford, and maybe lots of people in this room can't afford. But, I somehow don't feel intimidated to go and enjoy it, right? I can access it and not buy anything, but I feel comfortable in doing that. And the notion that, there are housing developments adjacent to that, and that those populations really just don't feel like it's for them, even though it's a public space and you can go there and not have to spend money, but it's quite intimidating. I think there was a missed opportunity to, and a little bit going back to the previous question of how earlier on as the project was being conceived, as you were thinking about program, were a wider diversity of populations engaged in the co-creation of that programming and that design. What were the real proactive steps that were taken earlier on as opposed to retroactively? That could ensure that the design and even the design vocabulary were such that it would feel welcoming for all. It's really interesting. When I first started working in D.C. About the Navy Yard, there was a significant amount. It was a public housing development called Arthur Capper Carrollsburg. And we had an opportunity to go after one of the last Hope 6 funding buckets, Hope 6 being a program that was run out of HUD to provide funding to distressed public housing. And the notion was it was trying to deconcentrate poverty and had a formula of retaining a third of the public housing, adding a third affordable units, and adding a third market rate, which ultimately sort of reduced the amount of public housing. Another story. But early on, so we were doing some of the planning work, which was a requirement that you have robust civic engagement as a part of doing that work. And so there was a firm that was doing some of the design work and preparing for one of the early meetings and was beginning to show some of the vocabulary for some of the architecture there. So it was going to be moving into townhomes and other types of multi-story buildings. And I just remember residents kind of going, looking at that and saying, and I remember this woman very clearly, she's like, that's not for us. And so the notion that someone who is maybe has lived in generational poverty in a set of buildings that look fairly institutional could see a rendering of a fairly modest townhouse and just sort of automatically go, that is not for people like me, was heartbreaking. Right? So there is a way with which we, and this kind of gets me back to my point of kind of how we have to be tuned into some of these social justice issues as part of how we think about our design and our design vocabulary, right? So I feel like, had there been opportunities to do a bit more of that, just using the highlight as an example, and going forward, how you think about doing that in the future might be a way to kind of create spaces that can overcome those issues and really be spaces that can be used by all. One designer who I think is starting to do that really effectively is Walter Hood. He actually spends a lot of time, his firm Hood Design out of Oakland, spends a lot of time engaging with the different members of the community and really trying to understand the culture of place. And then having the aesthetic of that place be more reflective of that culture rather than his own sort of position on an aesthetic landscape. Although when you see a Walter Hood landscape, you know it's a Walter Hood landscape, but it's also very adaptable and very much of that place. And I think that's a practice that we should try to move forward to kind of create those spaces for all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We're going to have to hold these last three questions, so we can make Paula's party.
And we'll all be there so we can keep talking.
That's right.
Yeah.
Conversation will continue.
Okay.
Yes, sir. You're a gentleman.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm just thinking, like, how do you, whatever.
I hope so, yes. That's the good stuff, not the crazy stuff.
So my name is Mariah Williams, and I'm a second-year student in the work program here at VCU. And I'm also founder of a group called Black Girls Meet Up. And a lot of my interests... Black Girls Meet Up. Okay. And my interest in urban planning and research and just applied research is this idea of the need for Black space. I know in your presentation you talked a lot about how to bringing groups together, but you also talked about this idea of assaults constantly on Black and brown bodies. And so my idea on Black space is this idea of sometimes needing to escape these assaults, right? Whether that's through celebratory things, Black joy, self-care, whatever that is. But I recognize that in urban planning, and less so, that's kind of a very nuanced way of seeing our jobs as planners. And so one of my questions is, what do you see as a way to kind of bring more people of color, specifically more Black women, into the planning and architecture profession? Because as you mentioned, the low numbers of Black women who are architects, and I'm not sure what that is in planning, but I imagine it's
probably comparable.
It's probably comparable. And so in the same way that kind of STEM areas are trying to elevate the numbers of Black people of color in those areas, how do you see planning as a profession doing that?
Let me tell you how I intend to do it. This is my planning profession. Well, first I think, and what I have become more comfortable with over the last 4 or 5 years, is using my voice to write. Like I feel like now I've worked enough and I've seen enough and I actually have a point of view about stuff. And I need to put that into the world. So I've been writing more and accepting, invitations like this to come and talk to you, so that you see people like me, because I didn't see that when I was older. So that's a responsibility that I have. And while writing is really scary for me, I feel it is something I must do. Right? So when I was in school, the only black female scholar I knew of was Dr. Sharon Sutton, and she changed my life. Like, being a young person and reading someone who was writing architecture theory, like, oh my God, this is like amazing, right? And so I think a lot of what I'm doing is in part fueled by that small impression that I made. So that's like one responsibility that I have. It's also interesting because when you think about these neighborhoods and communities and stuff, there's another talk that I did that kind of pinpointed that some of the most affected people in these communities are actually women and children. Right, so there's got to be a way with which we talk a little bit more about these really sort of direct implications that we have, that these conditions have on our sort of cohort. The Black in Design conference that happened at Harvard a few weeks ago, did you happen to know about that? Or is this?
I did.
Okay. And so what was interesting is that this is the second year we've done it, and there was a group that presented called Black Space New York. And it's funny because we've been seeing that there have been a couple of them sort of popping up across the country, which is really, really cool. And they're going to be maintaining their web presence, and we're going to be linked to that. And so we hope that, we grow more things. I think in the time of social media, that it really is quite possible to build those networks and do a bit more exposure. As a young person, as a young professional, I encourage you to find forums, to bring these issues about and to do work, whether it's through professional development volunteering or within your actual job, to do that. But as us as educators and professionals of color, we've got to start writing and telling our stories a bit more, and I think that might help to grow the field. And as I said before, I really do encourage you all to think about spending time in different sectors, because you have different agencies depending on where you are. As a consultant, it was really cool and I got to design stuff, but I was held to the whim of my client. In the public sector, I had a lot more agency in terms of shaping agendas. I didn't have the pen in my hand, but I for sure shaped a lot of design in Washington, D.C. that I'm very proud of. So don't constrict yourself to a particular way with which you can practice. There's so much opportunity to practice across different sectors and really have different agencies at different points in your career. So I hope that was a little helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Hi.
Gentleman has the last question.
Thank you for speaking. I really appreciate it.
We can hear you. You can stand straight up.
I appreciated the way you presented a diverse set of metrics that provide nuance in the way you evaluate projects. No, I'm not a planner, and I'm actually not in urban policy at all. I'm an engineer by training. My research was into infrastructure and ethics behind that, and ethics of infrastructure. And I also grew up in a small rural town. And it seems to me that as the country moves forward, cities are going to have a lot of resources to work with. They're still growing, and there's room for that. And there's a lot of rural decay. And I wondered if you have any thought in terms of what a just ruralism might look like.
It's really great you bring that up, because I don't yet. But I will say, what this election has taught me, and maybe many of us, is that there's a whole other part of the country we just don't understand and know. And we damn sure better start trying to understand it. We don't have to agree with it, but we certainly need to understand it more. And I am not surprised, for you to raise the question that there is injustice in other contexts that may be very different from this, that also need attention and to be corrected, and for which policy and regulation and so forth might have a whole other set of assaults. So I'd love for you to offer up any top-of-the-head thoughts of things we might keep an eye out for that we need to bring into the conversation.
Thank you. Really quick, I suppose. I develop solar projects right now. That's my work, and so I spend a lot of time out in rural areas. there's a large concentration of wealth among the landowners who have owned land for a very long time. And now they've mechanized their farming system, so they have thousands and thousands of acres. A lot of wealth that travel the world and all over the place. And then you have small communities of black and white mixed groups of people and Hispanic all mixing in without really anything to do and anywhere to go. And it seems like you're going to have this one issue. My girlfriend and I talk about this a lot, flipping from rural areas of, okay, maybe it's vacation areas for wealthy people to go out from cities to go out and live in these rural areas that are pretty. But that seems ineffective, and it seems sort of unjust, and I don't really, it seems like some people serving, poorer people serving the wealthier people. So I don't really know, but I chew on it a lot, and I would love to hear more of your thoughts.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, being an infrastructure person, this notion of energy, perhaps, and how we're using that land resource in a way to think about other infrastructure sort of systems and platforms so that it is a productive landscape in some way might be a way that we need to start thinking more about those types of environments.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.